here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Well, it is Father's Day weekend, and a very big shout out to my dad and my stepfather, Vic. And you know, there's something about families and how they continue their father's legacy. And the Douglas family, patriarchal of Kirk Douglas, is no exception. I mean, Kirk Douglas, 100 years old, but look at the legacy and the kids he leaves behind, Michael Douglas, of course. And my next guest was the creator, the producer of this feature called A Father, a Son, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Mr. Taylor Purdee. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, yeah, I'm glad to be able to talk about it.
So let's talk about this. Obviously, this didn't come out of thin air. Did you have a love of the Douglas family? Is that why you wanted to make this project happen?
So this actually kind of came out of something that Kirk had wanted to do himself. I think he kind of like hit a point in his life when he felt able to look back on everything maybe a little more honestly than he would have in a different point. And so he reached out to the film's director, Lee Grant, who had been a co-star of his and is a film legend and Oscar winner in her own right. And so Lee works with my producing partners frequently, and so they kind of put it all together. And I came in more primarily recently for the re-release of this. Lee Grant's films last year had kind of disappeared, even though one of them had won the Oscar, and they were fabulously groundbreaking. But last year they kind of came back into the public eye, and I came on to oversee that part. And this is one of my favorites in the collection because it's a little lighter, and like you said, the Douglases are fascinating. But I think this primarily came out of Kirk wanting to say, hey, ask me anything. This is my 2004 Reddit AMA, and I'm an open book.
Now, I see you're the curator, I should say, of the series. So do you find yourself in sort of that TCM kind of feeling where you're doing these curations, or what's your style like?
So this is a kind of a very particular corner for me. Most of the time I'm a filmmaker, but Grant was somebody that I grew up with, and she works with people that I work with all of the time. And so kind of over the last couple of years, one day kind of off the cuff, she said to me about something that was in the news, like, hey, I think I made a movie about that. And I looked back, and she had made a number of films about things that are suddenly in the public consciousness. Like in 85, she made a film all about what it was like to be a transgender person in Reagan's America. But she made it in 85, and suddenly the rights reverted back to her. So I kind of went through her catalog of docs, and it turned out that all of the kind of like the most like hard-hitting films of hers were things that somehow they still had the rights to, including Down Out America, which had won the Oscar, and this one, which, like I said, is just I liked being able to put it in the series. One, because it breaks up some of the like hardcore social action documentary thing, and also it's really in conversation with Grant's own persona. Her first film was Detective Story with Kirk Douglas, which she was nominated for when she was 24. She won the Cannes Film Festival Award for it, and then was blacklisted before she could go to the Oscar ceremony. But Douglas, as kind of this recurrent character in her life, I think is fascinating. Probably why they decided to work together on this. He was the star in her first movie. And then years later, Michael and her husband / producer, Joseph Fury, would be great friends in what we call the New Hollywood era in the 1970s.
Well, we had actually met Lee Grant at the Film Forum after one of her documentaries. I believe it was Down and Out in America. I could be wrong, but I think that was the one. And let me tell you, she is so spry and she is so talkative. My dad and her hit it off. I mean, it was very cool to meet her at the Film Forum. That's
so cool. That was like one of the days that I wasn't there. That's so crazy. Okay. And
so that was pretty cool. But I could see that, she's a very film historian herself, so I could see that love of Douglas. And so you come in because and obviously you're doing this because you're interested in the Douglas family as well, right? Oh,
yeah. And I mean, part of, like you said, he lived to be 100 or 101. And part of that, she's, oh my God. But part of that means that both he and then, obviously the rest of the family a look at Kirk Douglas's career is a look at like Hollywood in the 20th century. Like he hits so many corners of it. So it's hard to be a real Kirk Douglas fan without having an interest just in like the arc of cinema.
What do you think of the what do you think of the state of fatherhood in America? Like, it seems like there's a sector that doesn't want to honor Father's Day even. So, I mean, is his role sort of the ideal what the patriarchal family should be? What are your thoughts on that?
So that's definitely one of the things that I think is most interesting about the way that Grant did this film, and it's that Kirk doesn't come off as a great father in this film, but he comes off as a man who found himself at the crossroads of like almost like destiny. He's not just a movie star. We almost can't imagine. He's like, I don't know, Robert Downey Jr. at the height of Iron Man of his day. He's not just a movie star. He's the biggest movie star in the world. And that's
He's
cool.
Spartacus, right?
He's Spartacus. He is Spartacus. And that's cool and great for him, but it also means that doesn't leave a lot of time for hanging out with the kids. And yet, in both of his marriages, he made a point to, in my opinion, choose women who were intelligent and strong-willed and would make good mothers in his absence. And one of the things about Kirk Douglas, he's not just an actor. He is like a prolific memoirist. He's written numerous memoirs, all on different things. And one recurrent theme is his terrible relationship with his own father, but his fabulous relationship with his mother. He went on to name his production company after her. And sometimes there's this element of, he can see that he can't make it home for dinner. He can see that he has to build this career over the course of the first marriage and then kind of keep it going, keep this like absurd level of stardom alive during the second marriage. And in some ways, I think that he sacrificed a lot of the family elements for that. But he did make a point to choose these women that he, I think, trusted with rearing his children. And by the time his second marriage rolls around, he's already way more established and can hang out with the kids more. And I think Michael probably benefited from that.
Well, let's talk about that because obviously Michael, I think he's a great actor in his own right. I mean, he has a namesake, but he definitely was distinct from his father, wasn't he?
Oh, 100%. I mean, and not just as not just. Not just as an. Is there something?
Oh, sorry. There you go. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you're good. Not just as an actor, though. I mean, as a producer on The China Syndrome and Cuckoo's Nest, and so just kind of for anybody who's not a major film nerd, the kind of background context is obviously Kirk Douglas is a star of like golden era Hollywood, classic old school Hollywood. We all kind of get what that is. But the era where Michael's coming up in the late 60s, early 70s is a period that we call New Hollywood. And it's an important moment because it's where kind of the culture clash of the 60s made it to Hollywood, and the people running the studios by the early 70s realized that the old guard had no idea what was going on, and they kind of opened up the gates to this new group of young filmmakers, which is how you get Scorsese and George Lucas and Hal Ashby. And Douglas is right in there with them. And one flew over the Cuckoo's Nest, which, definitely, Nicholson was a movie star by then, but this canonized him. That film is incredible and legendary and won the Oscar. But and it's a really important moment both in Douglas's career because he steps into his own right as a producer and a filmmaker and kind of a power player who's making important work, not just popular work. But it's a rift between he and Kirk that they dealt with for the rest of their lives. In some ways, one of the first, I think one of the only times they really talk about, this rift in their lives and move past that, I think, is in this movie. And the problem was that Kirk Douglas had bought the rights to Cuckoo's Nest. He'd done it on Broadway. He played the Jack Nicholson role and was kind of nursing along, wanting to produce it and play the role himself. And eventually he was going to give up. He couldn't set it up at any studio. And Michael said, "Hey, Dad, give me a chance. I'm in with the young guys. Let me see if I can do it." And of course, Douglas got the money, or Michael Douglas got the money. But Kirk was too old to play it. And this was a big problem for them because Michael had to essentially take the script, take the rights to the movie, fire his dad from it, and then, insult to injury, Jack Nicholson goes on and wins the Oscar for it. And so I think Kirk, for years, felt like totally torn down and replaced by Michael over the course of Cooper's Nest.
Well, I want to talk about the footage that's in this film because it looks very vintage. It looks home movie style. So how did you guys collect all of this, and how did that come about?
Okay, so I'm glad that you asked, because that is one of the craziest things about this film. You make a documentary about any family, you interview them, you have like home movie footage, but getting a home movie footage from the Douglas archive, whole other thing. So there was like a whole corner of the production that was just one of the producers, Roberta Morris, just like in Kirk's private archives, going through this footage, going through the Super 8 footage, the 16mm footage, just trying to see what was cool. And that's one whole element of it, the archival home footage stuff. There's something, I think it's actually in the film, of like Walt Disney inviting the Douglas family to Disney World for a private tour, which is super cool because your dad's a movie star and you can do that. But then at the end of the day, Walt Disney filmed this and kind of turned it into this propaganda commercial of like, well, if Kirk Douglas brings the family to Disneyland, you should too. But Douglas and Disney are on opposite sides of so many things, not least of all Hollywood blacklist. And that's the whole other corner. But then the footage from the films, it was just the first minute of the film has like 12 clips from Spartacus and The Bad and the Beautiful and all of these major motion pictures. And just like, the studio didn't give Kirk that for free. And going through that and licensing all of those things from all of these different studios from every different era of his career, it's lucky that Kirk was still kind of beloved in Hollywood, because if he'd been a guy that the studios were mad at 30 years later, who knows what we would have had to work with on this. And that combination of like going through the studio archives.
Are you saying there was a possibility Kirk Douglas could have been canceled if he disagreed with the industry? Is that what you're telling me?
Kirk Douglas went to war with the industry and won. We were talking about the blacklist. Totally. From the benefit of hindsight, it feels like, oh man, he's Kirk Douglas. He could, was always going to be a movie star. But every year, if you don't make a movie, there's a chance you disappear. And he is working in the studio system. You piss off, MGM, piss off Mayer. Who knows what's going to happen to you? And one of his most important contributions to, I would argue, American culture, not just film culture, is, and there's some contention over who gets credit for this, but I'm going to give it to Kirk. He's credited with breaking the Hollywood blacklist in a way by crediting Dalton Trumbo, the blacklisted writer, on Spartacus, which was something that the SUAC committees had a list of actors and writers and everybody who you couldn't hire, and it was really, really bad if you hired them. It was illegal to hire them. They could not work in film and television. A lot of them, including Trumbo, who is prolific, wrote under pseudonym. And Douglas insisted, like, hey, this movie is so good. I am such a big movie star. This movie cost the studio too much money. They're not going to pull it, and they're not going to fight me too hard. I think I can put the real writer's name on the film. And even among his team, there was some discussion on, like, well, I don't know, maybe Stanley Kubrick, the director, should take credit, and on and on and on. And so Douglas said, no, screw that. We're putting Dalton's name on. And they did, and the film was such a giant hit that it effectively was the beginning of the end of this period of the blacklist. Wow.
This is very intense, because some people may not know that history. I'll see the guy on screen, but they don't. How many, percentage-wise, how much do you think people know of that history of Kirk Douglas besides the film? Like, do you think there's a good portion, or are there some people that don't know a lot about him?
I'm sure there are tons of people who don't know about. I'm sure sometimes I have to talk about Kirk Douglas as Michael Douglas' dad at this point. So definitely there are people who don't know about that element. There are tons of people who do. It's a very famous thing, but it's famous to a different generation perhaps. And yet totally relevant, because we're still dealing with ideas of blacklisting and free speech in Hollywood. So
to be a conservative in general in Hollywood is very, very frowned upon, it seems like. That's the general feeling. Maybe you have some insight to that, but that's what it feels like right now.
I mean, there is a cliche that conservatism in Hollywood is always kind of looked down upon. That's true. And I mean, I guess the line is always like, there's conservatism and there's being a dick. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of lines that people are always trying to walk there, and that's kind of what's scary. I mean, in a lot of ways, and we just did a really good interview on this. In a lot of ways, it's not a fair comparison, the Hollywood blacklist to cancel culture, but there is an element of them being in conversation with one another, and I do think that that's an important thing for everybody on every side to take stock of. So I hope that the history of the blacklist comes more and more into the consciousness, one, because it should be always, and two, because in a number of ways it speaks to what we're dealing with now.
We're seeing a lot of stories about, some here and there about how Bing Crosby wasn't a great father, or, just general like outpouring of my father wasn't as good. But does this film give fatherhood a hope? Is there a hope for fatherhood through this movie? Or?
Oh, 100%, man. And so one of the things that's really great about this movie, and I would say derivative of what kind of the style that Grant and our producing team kind of was working with, and period they made this is not like a talking head documentary. This is not like, and then in 1957, Kirk Douglas won the Academy Award. This is, the whole film is built around Kirk and Michael sitting at a dinner table, just like shooting the shit. And because of that style, and because Kirk and Lee Grant had such a history together, this is like, there's something both like conversational, intimate about it, but also I think the Douglas family trusted Grant and her team and family to lampoon them and call out their foibles in a loving but fair way. And so there's a very real sense of like family in this movie. I mean, it is about family, but I mean, Kirk and Michael and Michael's brothers and Catherine Zeta-Jones is in it, and Michael's son Cameron is in it, and it really is just this sense of, like in some ways the calmest, most star-studded Thanksgiving dinner with a ton of great studio footage. And yeah, at the end of the day, they lay, the two of them especially, it's really built around Kirk and Michael, and they lay kind of all of their trials and successes with one another on the table, and they try to find a way to forgive one another. And I think at the end of the day, more than just like, oh, fatherhood is great, this is a very real kind of celebration of fatherhood, because it says, yeah, dads are important and you need them, but boy, oh boy, are they not always great. And how do we deal with that together? And at this point in time, 2021, like Michael is a grandfather twice over. His son Cameron just had his memoir come out like a year ago, and this legacy continues, and it is a convoluted and not smooth legacy, but one consistent element is this sense of them working through their scars with one another, and frequently doing it through art, whether it's the film or Cameron's memoir. They're trying to still be a family, and I think largely they succeed.
Taylor, I got to ask you something personal. I mean, personally, going through these clips, how did you feel knowing that you loved the Douglas family and then you've seen this? What was that like for you?
Sure. I mean, there's always that element of how much do you want to know about your heroes and all of that. But I do think that for me, there really is an element of Kirk was such a star that, I mean, I can imagine not being able to make it home for dinner every day, and that's a choice that he makes. And like somebody might say, well, maybe you need to choose between being a movie star and being a father, but you can't do that in 1950s. He wouldn't have been allowed to be a movie star without a family. The studio would have forced him to marry. We know that. There's endless history of that.
Well, let's talk about that, because obviously the point. Well, let me finish it up. But you just struck another question.
Go for it.
Because in the 50s and 40s, you wanted that perfect American family. So it seems what you're saying is Hollywood did the best to make that appearance for the Douglas family, would you say?
So I'd say that it's kind of a 50-50 in their case, because there are stars of that era that literally had crafted families that the studio picked or, at least said you can't marry that one, you could marry this list of 10. Kirk Douglas is a straight man who married straight women and had children with them. He chose his own wives because he, in some ways, by being a straight man, was able to do that. And yet, that image there, the image is totally crafted. I mentioned this going to Walt Disney land and Disney kind of taking advantage of that, but of course, every time he steps out of his house, there's a team of press agents. In some of the the movies just came back out. They're finally available again, in a number of places. But Reel One, which is the distributor's special, it's the only place to get the special edition of the films. Reel1.com has the film and all of the Douglas archive stuff, and those are great, super cool. And in one of them, they have footage of him taking his handprints on at the Chinese theater, that kind of classic thing. And everything from hey, you've got to go do this now, to he's having a swimming party and it's Rita Hayworth and her PR team are in the background because this was arranged. But that's how the system works.
Well, but for you, Taylor, just getting into how you felt watching all these clips, just elaborate on that a little bit. Balancing out the artist and the art is always a bit of an issue, but I guess I feel like they're not the family that anybody would paint to put on a 1950s sitcom, but that's why they're so relatable and real. No family is the Leave It to Beaver family, and then you take not stardom but superstardom and put that on top. To me, it's amazing that Michael Douglas manages to have a career of his own. There's so many children of celebrities that just can't either deal with Hollywood or deal with a lot of the world, because the stardom is an unnatural thing, and it has a lot of ripple effects, especially on a growing mind. And the fact that anyone in that family managed to not just come out stable, but succeed and thrive, I think is a testament to how, early in his career, Kirk started to realize, wow, I am being a giant star, but maybe my home life isn't perfect. And then by the time his second marriage rolls around, he kind of doubles down on trying to find a way to build the family out and be the father that his children deserve. And I think that he starts to turn it around, maybe a little too late in everybody's lives, but he does do it. And I'd say that being able to do that, period, while being the biggest movie star in the world, is a feat of manhood. So you're saying no addiction or anything ran through that family at all? Or
there's definitely addiction in that family, which is terrifying. From my understanding, that's something that Kirk dealt with much, and that, mostly the Douglases, and maybe this makes sense, the Douglases who you've heard of largely are the ones who either didn't deal with that so much or beat it quickly. One of the really heartbreaking elements of actually making this film was that there were interviews set up with Eric Douglas, one of the brothers, that we just never got because he died while this film was being made. He died from his addiction. And that's terrifying. But then the flip side is Cameron Douglas, Michael's eldest son, has very publicly struggled with addiction for most of his life. He talks about it in this film. He's 20-something at this point, and now he's a father. I think he's in this film is from 2005, so he's much older than that now. But he's been very candid about how addiction was very difficult for him and how it sent him to jail multiple times. And yet, he was lucky enough to, it seems, he's beaten it now. And yet,
and that's because, as you said earlier, these stars still made sure family came first. It seems like that's how Cameron was able to go through it, because I'm sure Michael supported him through that. Maybe even Kirk did too.
Oh, they definitely were an emotionally supportive family, and obviously a financially supportive family, insofar as I'm sure they, paid his legal fees. But at the end of the day, Eric Douglas, Michael's brother, has succumbed to his addiction in 2004 or 5. So, I mean, there's also that element of support can only go so far, especially in some ways non-professional support can only go so far. But I would say Cameron is a good example of going into like that. I mean, like I said, his memoir's out, and he's pretty candid about how into the depths of addiction he got. It wasn't just, oh boy, that was a party and I partied too hard. He ended up in jail, I think, a number of times for long stretches of time. And yet, on the other side, he came out and I think now he's married to the woman that he's been dating when he went in the last time, and they came together, and now they have a child. And so that is a very atypical roadmap. But at the end of the day, it still ends with family and fatherhood.
Taylor, I've got to ask you this because obviously you're a curator and you love to be in front of the people. But on a personal note, how did you do this pandemic? Were you curating on Zoom? Like, what was that like for you?
Oh, my God. So the curation element, yeah, there was, we got good at Zoom, and I would say getting Lee good at Zoom was something I actually didn't think that she'd be interested in or figure out. But I was like trying to explain Zoom to the people that I was out of New York for most of the apocalypse, and Lee was with her husband and his twin sister in Manhattan. And I've been trying to set interviews for all of us to do, and Zoom just seemed too much. And then one day I got like an invite from them, and it was like, hey, come to so-and-so's Zoom birthday party, you and all of the octogenarians. And so, yeah, there was a learning curve, especially curating things that both involve older people and are maybe targeted at older people. Yeah. And yet, I will say, it seems like everybody kind of figured it out. And in my experience, by like May or June, even like the older audiences for like this is the kind of series that was playing at like repertory houses in older neighborhoods, and everybody seemed to figure out how to tune into the virtual cinema. So that's awesome. That was positive. I'm glad you mentioned people in the different virtual world, because I know we're probably talking to movie fanatics right now. Yeah. So. And some of them may even know from the 2005 documentary. So the remastering, what's different? What's new? What did you guys add to it? So on this particular film, because it was made more recently, we had a little less work to do. It's made from the HBO master, which only had a couple flaws that I had to go in and kind of just find other digital footage to replace the back footage with. But for me, the really cool thing is that on the special edition, which is on Reel One, not on Amazon or the other places. It's got a number of things that we pulled right from Kirk's home archive. One of the things is like the home movies, and it's all of the little boys hanging out by the pool, but then, like I said, like suddenly Lana Turner walks in or somebody like that, and that just kind of adds life for them. Then there's the kind of more official home movies, like I was talking about him getting his handprints. So that's that's the glitzier side of it. And then there's a really great interview that we filmed kind of around the time we were making this movie that I re-edited some new things for, of Lee talking about the making of the film. And that's interesting because, Grant had been through all of the 20th century right there with them, and her career is kind of, at least it started by Kirk, and her career kind of runs parallel with both of the Douglases. She's got a foot in classic Hollywood, and then, of course, her most famous films are from New Hollywood because she'd been blacklisted in the middle. And so her life intertwined so well with both the Kirk and Michael. And I really would say, like, I would want people to watch those additional features, because when have you ever gotten to watch Kirk Douglas' home movies? Never. They're so incredible. And he filmed some of them himself. It's great.
So where can people find them? Give them their website. Give them your social, too, in case they want to follow you also.
Sure. So for information about all the Lee Grant stuff, the distributor is Hope Runs High. You can Google them, or at Hope Runs High on any of the socials. I'm Taylor Purdee, Taylor, Taylor, Purdee. And the films are available. And the films are available a bunch of places. They'll start hitting more and more of your favorite like video on demand places as the summer goes on. But right now, you can get them on Amazon, a new service called Altavad, or Real1.com is where you can get all of the special editions, which has for all of the films. It's got additional interviews with grants on all of the films. It's got my program notes, and that's just like the whole all of the things you ever want are on REEL-1.com. But any place you go to get movies, they'll pop up. They're also, if you've got a library card and you're not in New York City, they're streaming on Canopy, which is a great service if you don't know about that. It's a great service for finding both very mainstream movies and off the beaten path movies. You get it through your library or your university. And yeah,
by the way, people don't know, Lee Grant does have a Instagram. I've tagged her on there actually. So
she does. She's Lee's on social. She's at the Lee Grant. The Twitter and the Facebook, I think, are where more of her things happen. Yeah, she's got Instagram. You should follow her everywhere because most of the time it's like great if you're a Lee Grant fan, but not infrequently she'll just do something that's hilarious or you wouldn't expect from a woman like her. You remember why she's Lee Grant. And if you don't know what I mean by why she's Lee Grant, Google her, Wikipedia her. The woman lived through every corner of the 20th century. She might be the only female actor to survive the blacklist. She was the first woman to win an award from the Director's Guild. She has an acting Oscar. She technically has a directing the documentary Oscar. Woman is a straight G, and y'all need to be obsessed.
The straight LG, right?
So, exactly.
Well, you know what, Taylor, because I go to film forum a lot, and I do love movies. Maybe people don't really know that on this podcast, and I don't talk about it as much, but if you do find yourself in the forum, let me know what events are upcoming, and I'll definitely bring you on to talk about that. Maybe people can find you at the forum this summer.
Oh man, I do hang out at Film Forum. Yeah, definitely. And the other thing that I should say that involves kind of all these pieces. I made a film that's not a documentary that came out in September, and it's coming back this September. Now that New York and Los Angeles are open, that Lee has a bit of a cameo in, and so that's when everybody go see the movie. But one of the interesting things about that from this Douglas perspective is between like the first week that it was open and the third week that it was open, one of the interesting changes was people would walk out of the theater and start recognizing one of the actresses that they hadn't recognized the first few weeks, because she's a young woman named Emily Metz, who had been on the Netflix series Ratched right when our film was premiering. And Ratched is the prequel to Cuckoo's Nest, the film that caused the strife between Kirk and Michael. And that I'm pretty sure Michael had a hand in developing because he still has the rights to that film because Kirk stopped him when he did the film on Broadway, when he did the play on Broadway and fell in love with it 50-some years ago. And so the sort of like intellectual genealogy of, because Kirk Douglas was randomly into some play in the middle of the 20th century, 2 generations later, this young woman suddenly is a little bit less obscure.
It's amazing it's amazing how that happened, isn't it? And it's also amazing that even, those who are on YouTube can become stars. Like, all of this is becoming interconnected. And I want to have you on to talk more about this because, Kirk Douglas is amazing, but just the idea that obscurity is disappearing because of all our different connections, right? So I'd love to talk about that with you in another
Definitely,
episode.
Man. Yeah.
So I'm Alex Garrett with Taylor Purdee. He's curating the documentary on the Douglas. I mean, this is so cool to even talk about this. The Douglas family and that curation. That movie, let me just tell you one more time, is A Father, a Son, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, from Reel 1 in Alta Vode. Taylor, thanks again, and we'll be sort of tuned into that and tune into more things you guys are up to.
Great. Awesome, man. Well, have a great Father's Day weekend.
You too. I'm Alex Garrett, where we're always adapting, talking movies, talking entertainment. We're covering a lot of stuff, and thanks for continuing to join us here on the Alex Garrett Podcast.
Well, Jake Russell of One Block, thank you for doing what you can for your community. Not in our backyard, not in our front yard. We won't accept the trash. We want to clean it up, and at least one organization gets that. Let's hope that continues onward through the city as we are moving post-pandemic. I'm Alex Garrett, where we're always adapting. Talk to you soon.